In the chaos of war, people often see only what they expect to see. Soldiers see enemies. Commanders see strategies. Civilians see terror. But sometimes, in the most desperate moments when hope seems lost and death feels certain, heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. This is the true story of a woman whose gentle hands had saved countless lives in hospital wards, whose soft voice had comforted the dying, and whose compassionate heart had never known hatred. She was known simply as the nurse, a figure of mercy in a world gone mad with violence. But on one fateful day when her people faced annihilation and the enemy thought victory was within their grasp, she would pick up a weapon that would change the course of history itself. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most unlikely person can become the most extraordinary hero, and that courage doesn't always come from those trained for battle. Sometimes it comes from those trained to heal. Elena Marchetti had always believed that life was precious, every single breath a gift that should be protected. Growing up in the rolling hills of northern Italy during the 1920s, she watched her grandmother tend to sick villagers with nothing more than herbs, prayer, and an unwavering determination to fight death itself. It was this same grandmother who first placed a stethoscope around young Elena's neck when she was 12 years old, whispering words that would echo through her entire life. "Your hands were made to heal, child. Never forget that." The family home sat on the edge of the village of San Marco, a place where everyone knew everyone else's name, where church bells marked the rhythm of daily life, and where the biggest excitement usually came from the weekly market. Elena's father worked the vineyards that stretched across the hillsides, his weathered hands coaxing life from the ancient soil. Her mother taught reading and writing to the village children in their small kitchen, using whatever books they could afford as precious windows to the wider world. But Elena's eyes were always drawn to something different. While other girls her age learned to cook and sew, she spent her afternoons following the village doctor on his rounds. Dr. Rossi was an old man whose beard had turned white from decades of service, and he carried his medical bag like a sacred relic. He noticed Elena's curiosity immediately and began teaching her small things: how to take a pulse, how to bandage a wound, how to recognize the signs of fever. "Medicine is not just about knowing what to do," Dr. Rossi would tell her as they walked between houses. "It's about seeing people when they are most vulnerable and choosing to help rather than turn away. Not everyone has that gift, Elena. You do." By the time Elena turned 18, her reputation as a healer had already spread beyond San Marco. She had learned to set broken bones, deliver babies, and tend to everything from minor cuts to serious illnesses. The formal nursing training she received at the regional hospital in Milan only added scientific knowledge to skills that seemed to flow naturally from her heart. The hospital in Milan was a different world entirely. The building itself was massive, with long corridors that echoed with footsteps and urgent voices. The smell of disinfectant replaced the familiar sense of her village home. Here, Elena learned about anatomy and pharmacology, about surgical procedures and emergency medicine. But more importantly, she learned about human suffering on a scale she had never imagined. Her fellow nursing students came from all over northern Italy, each bringing their own stories of why they had chosen this difficult path. There was Maria from Venice, whose brother had died from an infection that could have been prevented with proper care. There was Francesca from Turin, whose mother had survived tuberculosis thanks to a dedicated nurse who refused to give up. And there was Giulia from Naples, who simply said she couldn't stand by and watch people suffer when she had the ability to help. Elena excelled in her studies, but what set her apart was her ability to see beyond the medical condition to the person suffering from it. While other students focused on symptoms and treatments, Elena remembered names and stories. She would sit with patients who had no visitors, hold the hands of those facing surgery, and find ways to bring smiles to children who were scared and far from home. "You have something special, Elena," her supervisor, Sister Catherine, observed during her final year of training. "I've been training nurses for 30 years, and I can always tell which ones will make a real difference. You don't just treat diseases, you heal people." The distinction mattered more than Elena realized at the time. Medicine could cure illness, but healing involved something deeper, addressing not just the physical problem, but the fear, loneliness, and despair that often came with it. Elena had learned to recognize the difference between a patient who was getting better and a patient who was truly healing. In 1939, Elena graduated with top honors and returned to her home region, accepting a position at the hospital in the larger town of Bergamo. It was close enough that she could visit her family regularly, but far enough to give her the independence she craved. The hospital served dozens of small communities scattered across the mountainous terrain, and Elena quickly became known as the nurse who would go anywhere, anytime, to help someone in need. Her colleagues respected her skill, but they also noticed something else about Elena. her complete dedication to saving life. She had never shown anger or hatred toward anyone, regardless of their background or circumstances. When treating patients who had been injured in bar fights, she showed the same compassion to both the attacker and the victim. When caring for travelers from other countries, she never asked about their politics or beliefs. This philosophy would soon be tested in ways Elena could never have imagined. By the late 1930s, the political situation in Europe was becoming increasingly unstable. Strange new terms entered everyday conversations: fascism, nationalism, racial purity. Elena heard these discussions in the hospital cafeteria and around dinner tables, but they seemed distant from her daily reality of caring for sick children and helping women through difficult births. The first real sign that the outside world was changing came in the form of new regulations at the hospital. Certain types of patients were to be reported to government officials. Medical records were to be reviewed by people who had no medical training. Questions were asked about patients' family backgrounds and religious beliefs, questions that had nothing to do with their medical care. Elena found these changes disturbing, but she was not yet prepared to openly challenge them. She was, after all, just a nurse in a small hospital in a quiet corner of Italy. What could she possibly do to influence the larger forces that seemed to be reshaping Europe? Her answer came on a cold December morning in 1939, when she was asked to care for a patient who had been brought in during the night. The man was in his 50s, with injuries that suggested he had been beaten. His chart listed only a number, not a name, and included a red stamp that Elena had never seen before. "What does this stamp mean?" she asked the attending physician. Dr. Castellano, a man she had always respected, looked uncomfortable. "It means he's being held pending investigation. Political prisoner, they called him. We treat him, but we don't ask questions." Elena looked at the patient more closely. His injuries were severe but treatable. More concerning was the look in his eyes. Not just physical pain, but the deep exhaustion of someone who had given up hope. She had seen that look before in terminal patients, but this man's injuries were far from fatal. "What did he do?" she asked quietly. "Does it matter, doctor?" Castellano replied, but his tone suggested that he was asking the question as much to himself as to her. Over the next 3 days, Elena cared for the unnamed patient with her usual dedication. She cleaned his wounds, administered pain medication, and monitored his recovery. But she also did something else. She talked to him. Not about politics or why he was there, but about simple human things. The weather outside his window, the taste of the soup being served for lunch, the sound of birds that could be heard in the early morning. Slowly, the man began to respond. He told her his name was Giuseppe, and that he was a teacher from a small town south of Bergamo. He had been arrested for refusing to use government-approved textbooks that contained what he called lies about history and science. He had 3 children and a wife who didn't know where he was. "I'm not a political person," Giuseppe said one afternoon as Elena changed his bandages. "I just believe that children should learn truth, not propaganda. Is that so dangerous?" Elena didn't know how to answer that question, but she knew that Giuseppe didn't deserve to be beaten for it. For the first time in her life, she found herself questioning not just individual decisions, but the entire system that had created this situation.
On Giuseppe's 4th day in the hospital, 2 men in uniform came to take him away.
His physical injuries had healed enough that he could walk, which apparently made him ready for whatever came next. Elena watched from the nurse's station as they handcuffed him and led him toward the exit. As he passed her desk, Giuseppe caught her eye and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Elena never saw Giuseppe again, and she never learned what happened to him. But something had changed inside her during those 4 days. She had always believed that her job was to heal people and then send them back to their lives. She had never considered that sometimes the world people returned to was more dangerous than the illnesses she treated. That night, Elena sat in her small apartment and thought about her grandmother's words. "Your hands were made to heal, child." But what did healing really mean? Was it enough to cure someone's physical injuries if you then sent them back to be hurt again? Was it enough to save a life if that life would be destroyed by forces beyond your control? These questions troubled Elena through the winter months of early 1940. The political situation continued to deteriorate, and more patients like Giuseppe began appearing in the hospital. People who had been beaten for asking questions, for helping the wrong neighbors, for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each case forced Elena to confront the same moral dilemma. How could she remain neutral and focused only on medical care when the very forces causing these injuries were growing stronger every day? The answer came in June of 1940, when Italy officially entered the war that had been consuming Europe. Suddenly, Elena's quiet hospital became a place where wounded soldiers were brought for treatment. At first, they were Italian soldiers injured in training accidents or minor border skirmishes. Elena treated them with the same dedication she showed all patients, regardless of their uniform. But as the months passed, the nature of the patients began to change. Allied soldiers who had been captured, resistance fighters who had been wounded in raids, civilians who had been caught in crossfire. And with these new patients came new pressures on Elena and her colleagues. You need to understand. The hospital administrator told the nursing staff during a meeting in early 1941 that some of these patients are enemies of the state. Your medical oath requires you to treat them, but your loyalty to Italy requires you to report anything suspicious they might say while recovering. Elena felt sick as she listened to these instructions. The medical oath she had taken specifically stated that she would do no harm and would protect the confidentiality of her patients. Now she was being asked to violate that oath in the name of patriotism. After the meeting, she walked outside into the cool evening air, trying to make sense of the conflicting demands being placed on her. The mountains around Bergamo looked the same as they always had, unchanged by human politics and wars. But Elena knew that she was changing, that the comfortable moral certainty she had lived with was no longer possible. Standing there in the fading daylight, Elena made a decision that would alter the course of her entire life. She would continue to heal everyone who came to her, regardless of their nationality or political beliefs. But she would not become a spy for any government, even her own. Her loyalty was to her patients and to the ancient promise of medicine to preserve life and relieve suffering. It was a decision that would soon put her in danger, test her courage in ways she never imagined, and ultimately transform her from a gentle healer into something far more complex, a person willing to kill in order to save lives. The knock came at Elena's apartment door at 3 a.m. on a cold February night in 1942. She had been working late, reviewing patient charts by lamplight, when the soft but insistent tapping broke the silence. In wartime, unexpected visitors at such hours rarely brought good news. Elena approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding. Through the thin wood she could hear whispered voices. More than one person, but speaking too quietly for her to understand the words. She had heard stories of midnight arrests, of people disappearing without explanation, of neighbors who reported on neighbors for suspicious activities. "Who is it?" she called softly. "Elena, it's Dr. Rossi," came the familiar voice of her old mentor from San Marco. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Elena opened the door to find not just Dr. Rossi, but also Father Martinez from a local church, and a young woman she didn't recognize. Their faces were grave, and they quickly stepped inside, looking nervously over their shoulders before Elena closed the door. "We're sorry to disturb you so late," Dr. Rossi began, "but we need your help with something that can't wait for morning." The young woman, who appeared to be in her early 20s, was pale and obviously in pain. She held one arm against her body in a way that suggested injury, and there were dark stains on her clothing that Elena immediately recognized as dried blood. "This is Anna," Father Martinez explained. "She's been helping people cross the mountains to reach safety in Switzerland. 3 days ago, German patrols caught her group near the border. She managed to escape, but she's been shot." Elena's medical instincts took over immediately. She guided Anna to a chair and began examining the wound. The bullet had passed through the upper arm, missing bone but causing significant muscle damage and blood loss. The wound showed signs of infection beginning to set in. "Why didn't you bring her to the hospital?" Elena asked as she gathered supplies to clean and bandage the injury. "Because the hospital has been infiltrated, Doctor," Rossi replied grimly. "There are informants among the staff now, people who report the names and details of anyone treated for suspicious injuries. If Anna showed up there with a gunshot wound, she'd be arrested before morning." As Elena worked to clean Anna's wound, the young woman told her story in halting whispers. She had been a teacher in Milan before the war, but when the persecution of Jewish families intensified, she had joined a network that helped people escape to neutral countries. Her group specialized in guiding refugees through the treacherous mountain passes that led to Switzerland. "At first, we only helped Jewish families," Anna explained, wincing as Elena applied antiseptic. "But then it became anyone who was in danger. Political prisoners, Allied soldiers who had escaped from POW camps, even German deserters who couldn't stomach what their army was doing." The escape network, Anna explained, relied on ordinary people throughout northern Italy, farmers who provided food and temporary shelter, priests who offered sanctuary in churches, doctors who treated injuries without asking questions, and guides who knew every hidden trail through the mountains. "We've been successful because we're careful and because we help each other," Anna continued. "But we're losing safe houses and contacts every week. The Germans and their Italian collaborators are getting better at tracking us down." As Elena finished bandaging Anna's arm, Father Martinez leaned forward. "That's why we've come to you, Elena. We need someone in the hospital who can help when our people are injured but can't seek official treatment. We need someone we can trust completely." Elena felt the weight of the request settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. What they were asking would put her job, her freedom, and possibly her life at risk. If she were caught helping escape prisoners or resistance fighters, she would face the same fate as the people she was trying to save. But as she looked at Anna's pale face, she thought about Giuseppe, the teacher who had been beaten for refusing to use propaganda in his classroom. She thought about the growing number of patients arriving at the hospital, with injuries that clearly came from torture, rather than accidents. She thought about her grandmother's words, about using her hands to heal, and her own vow to preserve life wherever she found it. "What exactly would you need me to do?" Elena asked quietly. Over the next hour, Dr. Rossi outlined a network that was both simpler and more dangerous than Elena had imagined. There were safe houses scattered throughout the region, usually in remote farmhouses or abandoned buildings. When someone in the network was injured too severely for basic first aid but couldn't risk going to a hospital, they needed someone with advanced medical training who could come to them. "You wouldn't have to leave the hospital permanently," Dr. Rossi explained. "But when we need you, you'd have to find a way to slip away, sometimes for several hours, sometimes overnight. And you'd have to bring medical supplies, antibiotics, surgical instruments, morphine for pain." The implications were staggering. Elena would essentially be stealing from the hospital to treat people who were considered enemies of the state. She would be lying to her colleagues about where she was going and what she was doing. She would be risking not just her career but her life. "How many people are involved in this network?" she asked. "More than you might think. Fewer than we need," Father Martinez replied. "In this region alone, we have about 30 active participants, but we lose people regularly. Some are arrested, some are killed. Some simply decide the risk is too great and stop helping." Anna, despite her pain and exhaustion, looked directly at Elena. "I understand if you can't do this. I truly do. I want you to know what's at stake. Last month alone, our group helped 43 people escape to safety. 16 of them were children under the age of 12. If we can't continue our work, those families will be sent to camps where they will almost certainly die."
Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine what 43 lives looked like. 43 people with names and hopes and families who loved them.
43 individuals who would live or die based on decisions made by people like her. "Give me 2 days to think about it," Elena said finally, "and to figure out how it could work without putting everyone else at risk." After her visitors left, Elena sat alone in her apartment until dawn, weighing the decision that lay before her. She had always believed that her calling was to heal people, but she had assumed that meant working within the existing system. Now she was being asked to work against that system, to break laws and violate regulations in order to save lives. The next morning at the hospital, Elena found herself seeing everything differently. The supplies in the medicine cabinet weren't just tools for treating patients, they were potential lifelines for people hiding in mountain caves. Her colleagues weren't just fellow healthcare workers, they were potential allies or threats depending on their loyalties. During her lunch break, she walked through the old section of Bergamo, studying the layout of streets and alleys with new eyes. If she were going to help the resistance network, she would need to know every possible route between the hospital and the surrounding countryside, every place where she could disappear quickly if someone were following her. That evening, Elena returned to her apartment to find a letter slipped under her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address written in pencil, and a time. Midnight tomorrow. At the bottom, someone had written, "If you decide to help, come to this address. If you decide not to help, burn this paper and forget you ever saw it."
Elena spent the second day observing her colleagues more carefully, trying to determine who might be sympathetic to the resistance and who might report suspicious activity.
She noticed that Dr. Castellano, who had seemed uncomfortable when discussing Giuseppe's case, often worked late and sometimes left the hospital carrying a medical bag even when he wasn't officially on call. Nurse Sophia, who worked in the emergency ward, frequently volunteered for extra shifts and never seemed to ask questions about patients with unusual injuries. And Father Martinez's presence in the hospital wasn't uncommon. He often visited patients who had no other family, and no one questioned his movements through the corridors. By the time Elena's shift ended on the second day, she had made her decision. The address on the paper led her to a small farmhouse about 5 kilometers outside of Bergamo. The building was dark except for a single candle burning in an upstairs window, the signal she had been told to look for. Inside, she found a group of 6 people gathered around a kitchen table. She recognized Dr. Rossi and Father Martinez, but the others were strangers, a middle-aged farmer, a young man who looked like a university student, an elderly woman with intelligent eyes, and Anna, looking much better than she had 2 nights earlier. "Welcome to the resistance," the farmer said with a wry smile, "though we prefer to think of ourselves as people who believe in helping our neighbors." The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Signora Benedetti, spread a hand-drawn map across the table. It showed the entire region around Bergamo, with dozens of small marks indicating safe houses, supply caches, and escape routes. "This is what we're up against," she explained. "German patrols have increased significantly in the past month, and they're being assisted by Italian militia units who know the local terrain. Our old routes through the mountains are becoming too dangerous to use regularly." The university student, whose name was Carlo, pointed to several locations on the map. "We've lost 3 safe houses in the past 2 weeks. The families who ran them are either dead or have been sent to concentration camps. We're having to move people much more quickly than we'd like, which means we can't always wait for injuries to heal properly." Elena studied the map, noting how the safe houses were positioned to create a chain of hiding places leading from the heavily patrolled areas near the cities up to the remote mountain passes that led to Switzerland. It was an ingenious system, but also fragile. The loss of any link in the chain could trap refugees in dangerous territory with no way to move forward or back. "What do you need from me specifically?" Elena asked. "Doctor." Rossi pulled out a small notebook and showed her a list of medical emergencies they had dealt with in recent months. Gunshot wounds, broken bones, severe cuts from barbed wire, infections from untreated injuries, complications from exposure to cold and malnutrition. The list was longer than Elena had expected and included several conditions that would normally require hospitalization. "We need someone who can handle serious medical emergencies in less than ideal conditions," he explained. "Sometimes that means operating by lamplight in a barn. Sometimes it means working on patients who can't make noise because there are patrols nearby. And sometimes it means making life-or-death decisions with limited supplies and no backup." The enormity of what they were asking began to sink in. Elena had performed complex procedures before, but always in sterile hospital environments with full teams of support staff and unlimited supplies. What they needed was battlefield medicine, and she had no training in that specialty. "I'll need to learn quickly," she said, "and I'll need help figuring out which supplies to take without causing suspicion at the hospital." Signora Benedetti smiled for the first time that evening. "That's where Dr. Castellano comes in. He's been quietly redirecting supplies for months, reporting them as damaged or expired when they're actually perfectly good. And Nurse Sophia has been volunteering for inventory duty, which gives her access to the supply rooms." Elena realized that the resistance network within the hospital was much more extensive than she had imagined. People she worked with every day were already risking their lives to save others, and they had been doing it so discreetly that she had never suspected. "How do communications work?" she asked. Carlo explained a system of coded messages that seemed deceptively simple. Medical appointments scheduled for fictitious patients were actually calls for help. Equipment requests that didn't quite make sense contained information about the number and condition of people needing assistance. Even the flowers left at certain graves in the cemetery conveyed messages about patrol movements and safe routes. "The most important thing to remember," Father Martinez emphasized, "is that if any of us are caught, we know nothing about the others. The network survives only as long as each person knows only what they absolutely need to know." Elena spent the next 3 hours learning procedures she had never imagined needing. How to perform surgery with limited anesthesia while keeping the patient quiet. How to treat gunshot wounds when you couldn't remove all the bullet fragments. How to handle traumatic amputations with improvised tools. How to recognize when a patient was too badly injured to save, and how to make them comfortable in their final moments without drawing attention to their location. By dawn, Elena had committed to memory locations of supply caches, recognition signals for various safe houses, and emergency procedures for situations ranging from unexpected patrol encounters to patients who died during treatment. She had also received her first assignment. A British airman who had been shot down 3 days earlier was hiding in a shepherd's hut high in the mountains, and his infected wound needed immediate attention. As she walked back to Bergamo in the early morning light, Elena realized that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer simply a nurse who happened to work in a war zone. She was now an active participant in a secret war being fought in shadows and safe houses, in midnight medical procedures and coded messages. The irony wasn't lost on her that in order to fulfill her calling as a healer, she had to become a criminal in the eyes of the law. But as she thought about the British airmen suffering in the mountains and the 43 refugees who had escaped to safety the previous month, Elena knew she had made the right choice. What she didn't yet know was that her commitment to saving lives would soon require her to make an even more difficult choice. the choice to take a life in order to preserve many others. That moment was still months away, but it was approaching with the inevitability of winter following autumn. The autumn of 1942, Elena had become two different people living in the same body. During her regular hospital shifts, she was the competent, reliable nurse that her colleagues had always known, professional, caring, and focused entirely on her patients' medical needs. But in the shadows of early morning and late evening, she was someone else entirely. A skilled operative in a resistance network that was saving lives and disrupting enemy operations throughout northern Italy. The transformation had not been easy. The first time Elena performed surgery in a barn by the light of oil lamps, she had nearly fainted from the stress. The patient was a French resistance fighter who had been shot while attempting to sabotage a German supply depot. The bullet had shattered his shoulder blade and punctured a lung, requiring immediate surgery that couldn't wait for transport to a proper medical facility. Working with improvised instruments and fighting against time while listening for sounds of approaching patrols, Elena had managed to remove the bullet fragments and repair the lung damage. But the experience had taught her that her medical school training, comprehensive as it was, had not prepared her for the psychological challenges of practicing medicine under these conditions. The weight of absolute responsibility was crushing. In the hospital, if she encountered a procedure beyond her capabilities, she could call for a surgeon or transfer the patient to a larger facility. In the resistance network, she was often the only person with advanced medical training within 100 kilometers. If she failed, people died, and their deaths would be entirely her fault. But Elena was learning to carry that weight, and her skills were improving with each emergency. She had developed techniques for performing complex procedures quickly and quietly. She had memorized dozens of improvisations for situations when proper equipment wasn't available. Most importantly, she had learned to make rapid assessments of which patients could be saved and which were beyond help, allowing her to focus her limited resources where they could do the most good. The network itself was evolving as well. What had begun as a small group helping Jewish families escape to Switzerland had grown into a sophisticated operation that moved dozens of people each week. They helped Allied soldiers who had escaped from prisoner of war camps, Italian civilians fleeing political persecution, and even German deserters who had refused orders to commit atrocities. Elena's apartment had become an unofficial coordination center for medical aspects of the operation. She kept detailed but coded records of supplies needed at various safe houses, maps showing which routes were safest for transporting injured refugees, and schedules for rotating medical equipment between different locations to avoid shortages. The work was exhausting, but it was also rewarding in ways that Elena had never experienced in her regular nursing duties. Every person she helped represented not just a medical success, but a human life that would continue, a family that would remain together, a story that would have a different ending than the occupying forces intended. One particular case had reinforced Elena's commitment to the resistance in a deeply personal way. In September, she had been called to treat a family of 5 who had been hiding in a cave system high in the mountains for 3 weeks. The parents were both professors from the University of Milan, and their 3 children ranged in age from 6 to 14. The family had been living on minimal food and water while waiting for safe passage to Switzerland, and all of them were suffering from malnutrition and exposure. The youngest child, a 6-year-old girl named Isabella, had developed pneumonia that threatened to become fatal without proper treatment. Elena had spent 2 days in the cave administering antibiotics and fluids while monitoring Isabella's condition. During the long hours of waiting to see if the treatment would work, the child's mother had told Elena their story. Professor Maria Alberti and her husband Roberto had been dismissed from the university when new racial laws targeted Jewish faculty members. Their academic colleagues, people they had considered friends for decades, had not only failed to protest the dismissals, but had actively supported them, hoping to advance their own careers. The betrayal was worse than the persecution, Maria had explained quietly while her daughter slept fitfully in Elena's arms. We expected hatred from our enemies, but we didn't expect abandonment from our friends. The family had initially hoped to wait out the war in hiding, but when rumors spread that all Jewish families in their city were going to be rounded up for deportation, they realized that escape was their only chance for survival. Isabella doesn't understand why we're living in a cave, Roberto had said, his voice breaking. She keeps asking when we can go home, when she can see her friends again. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that home doesn't exist anymore? Elena had managed to save Isabella's life, and the family had successfully reached Switzerland a week later. But their story had haunted her for weeks afterward. These were not abstract victims of war. They were educated, accomplished people whose only crime was their ancestry. A 6-year-old girl who had nearly died of pneumonia in a mountain cave should have been starting first grade in a comfortable classroom. The personal connections were making Elena more effective at her resistance work, but they were also making it more dangerous for her emotionally. Each success felt like a victory against enormous evil, but each failure felt like a personal betrayal of people who had trusted her with their lives. In November, Elena experienced her first major failure, and it nearly broke her resolve to continue. She had been called to treat a group of escaped Allied prisoners who were hiding in an abandoned monastery about 20 kilometers from Bergamo. 8 men, all of them seriously malnourished and suffering from various injuries sustained during their escape from a prison camp near Milan. The plan had been to treat them quickly and move them to a more secure location the following night, but German patrols had increased activity in the area, and the group was forced to remain in the monastery longer than anticipated. Elena made several trips to check on their progress, bringing additional medical supplies and food. On her 4th visit, Elena arrived to find the monastery surrounded by German troops. Hidden in the forest nearby, she watched helplessly as the 8 Allied soldiers were dragged out of the building. 3 of them had to be carried because they were too weak to walk. Men whose strength Elena had been slowly rebuilding over the previous week. The soldiers were loaded into trucks and driven away, presumably back to a prison camp where their attempted escape would result in severe punishment or execution. Elena never learned what happened to them, but she knew that her medical treatment had ultimately served only to make them healthy enough to be captured and likely killed. For several days after the monastery raid, Elena considered withdrawing from the resistance network. The knowledge that her efforts might be prolonging suffering rather than ending it was almost unbearable. She had become a nurse to save lives, but what was the point of saving someone, only to have them killed later? The answer came from an unexpected source. Anna, the young woman who had first introduced Elena to the resistance, appeared at her apartment one evening with news that changed everything. "I wanted you to hear this from me," Anna said, her face glowing with excitement. "The British airman you treated back in May, Flight Lieutenant James Morrison, he made it to England safely. But more than that, he's been flying missions over Germany, and his bombing runs have destroyed 2 ammunition factories that were producing weapons for the Russian front." Elena stared at Anna, not immediately understanding the significance of what she was being told. "Don't you see?" Anna continued. "The medical treatment you gave him didn't just save one life. Those ammunition factories would have produced enough weapons to kill thousands of Allied soldiers. By saving Morrison, you've saved countless other lives that we'll never even know about." The revelation forced Elena to think about her work in an entirely new way. The 8 Allied soldiers she had failed to save were a tragedy, but the dozens of people she had successfully helped were now contributing to the larger war effort against fascism. Every escaped prisoner who rejoined the fight, every refugee family that survived to rebuild their lives, every resistance fighter who lived to conduct more operations, they were all multiplying the impact of her medical work far beyond anything she could accomplish in a hospital. But the November raid had taught Elena something else important. The resistance network was under increasing pressure, and its survival depended on more than just medical support. The Germans were getting better at tracking down safe houses and intercepting refugees, and traditional resistance tactics were becoming less effective. During a December meeting at Signora Benedetti's farmhouse, the group discussed a troubling development. A new German officer had been assigned to coordinate anti-resistance operations in their region, and his methods were proving devastatingly effective. Oberst Heinrich Müller had arrived in Bergamo 6 weeks earlier with a reputation for crushing resistance movements in occupied France. His approach was methodical and ruthless. He would identify key nodes in the resistance network and then eliminate them systematically, causing the entire operation to collapse. "He's already shut down 3 major escape routes, Doctor," Rossi reported grimly, "and he's captured 2 of our most experienced guides. Under interrogation, they might reveal the locations of safe houses that we've used for months." Carlo, the young university student, had been monitoring German communications and had disturbing news about Mueller's next target. "He's identified the hospital as a source of medical supplies for the resistance. He doesn't know exactly who's involved yet, but he's planning to conduct a thorough investigation of all hospital personnel." The implications were terrifying. If Mueller's investigation uncovered the resistance network operating within the hospital, it wouldn't just mean the end of Elena's involvement. It would mean the deaths of Drs. Castellano, Nurse Sophia, Father Martinez, and dozens of other people who had been quietly helping the operation. "We need to suspend hospital-based operations immediately," Signora Benedetti declared. "It's too dangerous to continue." But Anna disagreed. "If we shut down the medical support network, we'll lose people unnecessarily. There are 40 refugees hiding in various safe houses right now waiting for transport to Switzerland. At least 6 of them need medical attention that they can't get anywhere else." The debate continued for hours with no easy answers. Suspending operations would save the network but doom individual refugees. Continuing operations might save those refugees but destroy the entire network's ability to help future ones. Elena listened to the arguments, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders once again. But gradually, an idea began forming in her mind, an idea so dangerous and so far from her nature as a healer that she initially dismissed it as impossible. As the meeting broke up without reaching a decision, Elena asked Dr. Rossi to stay behind for a private conversation. What if Mueller wasn't able to complete his investigation, she asked quietly. Dr. Rossi looked confused. What do you mean? He's a German officer with unlimited resources and authority. How could we possibly stop him? Elena took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change her forever. What if something happened to Mueller? What if he had an accident or became seriously ill? The old doctor stared at her for a long moment before understanding dawned in his eyes. Elena, what you're suggesting? I know what I'm suggesting, she replied, and I know it goes against everything I've ever believed about preserving life. But how many lives would we save by eliminating one man who's dedicated to destroying our ability to help people? Doctor. Rossi sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. You're talking about murder, Elena. Not becoming an assassin, that's not something you can come back from. Elena knew he was right, but she also knew that the mathematics of the situation were inescapable. Mueller would kill dozens, possibly hundreds of people if he succeeded in destroying the resistance network. She could prevent that by killing one man. Wasn't she morally obligated to do so? I need time to think about it, she said finally. But I want you to find out everything you can about Mueller's routines, his habits, his vulnerabilities. If we decide to move forward, we'll need detailed information. As she walked home through the dark streets of Bergamo that night, Elena felt as though she were standing at the edge of an abyss. On one side lay her identity as a healer, someone whose hands had been dedicated entirely to preserving life. On the other side lay the possibility of saving hundreds of innocent people by deliberately ending one guilty life. She had no way of knowing that within 2 weeks the choice would be made for her, and she would discover capabilities within herself that she had never imagined possessing. The morning of December 18, 1942 began like any other for Elena. She arrived at the hospital early, reviewed patient charts, and began her rounds with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized her work for years. Nothing in her demeanor suggested that she had spent the previous week learning to kill. The knowledge had come from unexpected sources. Carlo, the young university student, had contacts in the Italian military, who provided information about weapons and tactics. Anna had learned assassination techniques during her time with the French resistance before returning to Italy. Even Father Martinez had contributed, sharing knowledge about poisons that he had acquired during his seminary training in medieval church history. Elena had initially resisted learning about weapons, feeling that even touching a gun would violate her fundamental nature as a healer. But Anna had been insistent. You can't rely on poison alone, Anna had argued during their training session in an abandoned barn outside the city. Poison is unreliable, dosage is hard to calculate, timing is unpredictable, and there's always a chance the target will survive and identify you. If you're going to do this, you need to be prepared for the possibility of using more direct methods. The rifle Anna provided was a German Mauser that had been captured during a resistance raid on a supply convoy. It was a precision weapon, accurate at long range, and relatively easy to conceal and transport. Anna had spent hours teaching Elena the basics of marksmanship, using hay bales as targets in locations far from any houses or roads. Elena discovered, to her surprise and horror, that she had a natural aptitude for shooting. Her steady hands and precise attention to detail translated perfectly to firearms use, and within a week she could consistently hit targets at distances that impressed even Anna. You're a natural, Anna had observed after watching Elena place 6 consecutive shots within a hand-sized circle at 200 meters. Your medical training actually helps. You understand anatomy, you can visualize exactly where to aim for an instant kill. The compliment had made Elena sick to her stomach, but she continued training because she knew that if she was going to attempt this assassination, she needed to be certain of success. A wounded Mueller would be far more dangerous than a healthy one, and a failed attempt would doom not just Elena but everyone connected to the resistance network. Now, as Elena went about her normal hospital duties, she felt the weight of the concealed rifle beneath her winter coat. Mueller's schedule had been carefully observed for 2 weeks, and today presented the perfect opportunity for an attack. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 10:30, Mueller walked alone from the German headquarters to a small cafe 3 blocks away, where he met with local Italian officials who collaborated with the occupation forces. The route took him through a narrow alley that provided excellent cover for a sniper position, and the timing coincided perfectly with Elena's regular break between morning rounds and lunch shift. Dr. Rossi had provided the medical cover story that would account for Elena's absence from the hospital. She was supposedly visiting a patient in a remote farmhouse who required follow-up care after surgery, a routine assignment that wouldn't raise questions if she returned later than expected. As 10 o'clock approached, Elena felt her heart rate increasing despite her efforts to remain calm. She had delivered babies during complicated births, performed emergency surgery on critically injured patients, and worked through countless medical crises without losing her composure. But those situations had been about saving lives, not taking them. At 10:15, Elena quietly left the hospital through a side entrance, carrying her medical bag and wearing the heavy winter coat that concealed the rifle. The walk to the assassination site took 8 minutes, through back streets and alleys that she had memorized during her reconnaissance. The building she had chosen was a 3-story apartment house that had been damaged by bombing and subsequently abandoned. A collapsed section of the roof provided access to the upper floors, and a broken window on the 3rd floor offered a perfect view of the alley where Mueller would pass. Helena climbed carefully through the rubble, conscious of the need to avoid making noise that might alert neighbors or passers-by. The abandoned building smelled of mold and ash, and broken glass crunched quietly under her feet as she made her way to the sniper position. From the 3rd-floor window, she had a clear view of the entire alley. The distance to Mueller's walking route was approximately 150 meters, well within the range at which she had practiced shooting. The angle was slightly downward, which she had accounted for in her calculations. Elena set up the rifle carefully, using a piece of rubble as a support to ensure stability. She had memorized the ballistic calculations needed for the shot, accounting for wind speed, distance, and the slight downward trajectory. Through the rifle's scope, she could see pedestrians occasionally passing through the alley, going about their normal morning activities. At 10:28, Elena saw Mueller appear at the far end of the alley, walking with the precise military stride she had observed during her surveillance. He was alone, as always, dressed in his standard gray uniform with insignia that marked him as one of the most dangerous men in northern Italy. Through the rifle scope, Elena could see Mueller's face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with sharp features and pale blue eyes. There was nothing particularly evil about his appearance. He looked like any of thousands of German officers she might encounter in any occupied city. This ordinariness made the moment even more surreal. Elena had expected to feel hatred for Mueller, rage that would make it easier to pull the trigger. Instead, she felt only a cold, professional assessment of the task ahead of her. This man was a problem that needed to be solved, a threat that needed to be eliminated to protect hundreds of innocent lives. Mueller was halfway through the alley now, walking at a steady pace that would bring him to the optimal targeting position in approximately 30 seconds. Elena controlled her breathing, using techniques she had learned for managing stress during medical emergencies. Her hands were steady, her vision clear, her calculations precise. 20 seconds. Elena's finger moved to the trigger, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack without firing. She could see Mueller clearly now, could observe the small details of his appearance. The way he favored his right leg slightly, suggesting an old injury, the careful way he scanned his surroundings, the small scar on his left cheek that spoke of previous combat experience. 10 seconds. Elena began the final phase of the shooting sequence Anna had taught her. Breathe in slowly. Let half the air out. Hold steady. Begin the trigger pull. The rifle was perfectly aligned, the target clearly visible, all variables accounted for. 5 seconds. Mueller was in the optimal position, his path predictable, his pace consistent. Elena's finger tightened on the trigger, applying the slow, steady pressure that would send a bullet through his chest and end his threat to the resistance network forever. But at the moment when Elena should have completed the trigger pull, something extraordinary happened. Mueller stopped walking and turned to help an elderly woman who had stumbled and dropped her shopping bag. Elena watched through the scope as the German officer, the same man who had ruthlessly dismantled resistance networks throughout occupied Europe, carefully helped the woman collect her scattered groceries and steady herself on the icy cobblestones. The gesture lasted only 30 seconds, but it completely disrupted Elena's assassination plan. By the time Mueller resumed walking, he was past the optimal shooting position, and the angle would make a clean shot impossible. More importantly, Elena found herself unable to reconcile the man she had just observed with the monster she had planned to kill. Elena lowered the rifle and watched Mueller disappear around the corner at the end of the alley. She had missed her opportunity, and she knew that another one might not present itself for weeks. But in that moment, she felt relief rather than frustration. The walk back to the hospital gave Elena time to think about what had happened and what it meant. She had been prepared to kill Mueller, based on his actions and their consequences for innocent people. But seeing him show simple human kindness to a stranger had reminded her that even enemies were human beings, with the capacity for both evil and good. This realization didn't change Elena's assessment of the threat Mueller posed to the resistance network. If anything, his humanity made him more dangerous, because it suggested intelligence and unpredictability, rather than simple brutality. But it did force her to question whether assassination was the only solution to the problem he represented. Elena returned to the hospital and resumed her normal duties, but her mind was working furiously on alternative approaches to the Mueller problem. By the end of her shift, she had developed the outline of a plan that was both more complex and more in keeping with her identity as a healer. That evening, Elena met with Dr. Rossi at his small apartment near the cathedral. "I couldn't do it," she told him simply. "Not because I was afraid, but because I realized there might be a better way." Rossi listened carefully as Elena outlined her alternative plan. Instead of killing Mueller, she proposed to incapacitate him, to use her medical knowledge to cause a condition that would require his evacuation to Germany for treatment, effectively removing him from the region without taking his life. "It would have to look like a natural illness," Elena explained. "Something serious enough to require specialized treatment that's not available here, but not so obvious that it would be recognized as an attack." The plan Elena proposed involved introducing a carefully calculated dose of bacterial infection into Mueller's food or drink, causing symptoms that would mimic a serious but treatable condition requiring immediate evacuation to a major German medical center. The timing would need to be perfect and the dosage precisely calculated to ensure the desired effect without causing permanent harm or death. "You realize this is still incredibly dangerous," Dr. Rossi pointed out. "If you're caught, the consequences will be the same whether you killed him or just made him sick." Elena nodded. "I know the risks, but I also know that this approach gives us a better chance of success, and it allows me to remain true to my oath as a healer." Over the next week, Elena refined her plan with input from other members of the resistance network. Anna was initially skeptical, arguing that assassination would be more certain and final. But Father Martinez supported Elena's approach, pointing out that it would achieve their goal without adding to the cycle of violence that was consuming Europe. The opportunity came on Christmas Eve, when Mueller attended a reception for German officers and Italian collaborators at the municipal building. Elena had arranged to be on duty at the hospital that evening, providing her with both an alibi and access to the bacterial cultures she needed for her plan. Working in the hospital laboratory after hours, Elena carefully prepared a culture of Salmonella bacteria, calculating the precise concentration needed to cause severe illness without permanent damage. The bacteria would be introduced into a glass of wine that Anna would arrange to have served to Mueller at the reception. As Elena worked, she reflected on how far she had traveled from the young woman who had entered nursing school with dreams of healing the world. She was still healing, but the methods had become far more complex than she had ever imagined. Sometimes healing meant using medicine to cure disease, but sometimes it meant using disease as medicine to cure a larger sickness. The plan worked perfectly. Within 12 hours of the reception, Mueller was experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress that mimicked food poisoning but showed complications suggesting a more serious underlying condition. German military doctors, lacking the specialized equipment needed for proper diagnosis, arranged for his immediate evacuation to a military hospital in Berlin. Mueller's departure created exactly the disruption in German anti-resistance operations that Elena had hoped for. His replacement was less experienced and far less effective, allowing the resistance network to resume full operations within days of Mueller's evacuation. But Elena's moment of triumph was short-lived. 3 days after Mueller's departure, Anna burst into Elena's apartment with devastating news. "They found the monastery safe house," Anna said, her face pale with shock. 43 refugees, including 8 children. They were all killed during the raid. Elena felt the world spinning around her. While she had been congratulating herself on finding a humane alternative to assassination, 43 innocent people had died because she had failed to permanently eliminate the threat that Mueller represented. "It was his intelligence network," Anna continued. "Mueller had already identified the monastery before he got sick. His subordinates just followed through on his plans." The mathematics of Elena's choice were brutal in their clarity. By choosing to preserve Muller's life, she had allowed 43 innocent lives to be lost. Her commitment to healing had become, in effect, a commitment to killing. That night, Elena sat alone in her apartment, staring at the rifle that Anna had left with her. In trying to remain true to her identity as a healer, she had failed in her larger responsibility to protect innocent life. The next time she faced such a choice, she would be ready to make it differently. She had no way of knowing that the choice would come again within days, and that this time, there would be no opportunity for moral complexity or elegant alternatives. The next time, it would be kill or watch hundreds die, and Elena would discover what she was truly capable of when everything she cared about hung in the balance. The dawn of January 15, 1943, brought news that would transform Elena from a conflicted healer into a legendary warrior. A massive German operation coordinated from the highest levels in Berlin was set to begin within hours. The target was not just the resistance network Elena had been supporting, but every safe house, escape route, and sympathetic family in a 100-kilometer radius around Bergamo. Anna arrived at Elena's apartment at 5 in the morning, her face grim with exhaustion and terror. She had been traveling all night, carrying intelligence that had cost 3 resistance fighters their lives to obtain.
They call it Operation Alpine Cleansing, Anna said, spreading captured German documents across Elena's kitchen table. It's not just about stopping the resistance anymore.
They're planning to eliminate anyone who has ever helped refugees, anyone who has ever questioned German authority, anyone they consider unreliable. Elena studied the documents, her blood growing cold as she read the scope of the operation. 700 German troops, supported by Italian militia units and police, would simultaneously raid more than 200 locations throughout the region. The operation was designed to be completed in a single day, leaving no time for warnings or escapes.
How many people are we talking about? Elena asked, though she already feared the answer. Over 3,000 names on their target lists, Anna replied.
Men, women, children, elderly people, who gave a loaf of bread to a hungry refugee. They're planning to arrest everyone on these lists and transport them immediately to concentration camps.
Elena felt sick as she read through page after page of names. She recognized many of them: farmers who had allowed refugees to rest in their barns, priests who had provided sanctuary, teachers who had refused to use propaganda textbooks.
The vast majority were not resistance fighters, but ordinary people whose only crime was maintaining their humanity in an inhumane time. When does it start? Elena asked. Anna checked her watch. 6 hours. The coordinated raids begin at 11 this morning. By evening, everyone on these lists will be dead or on trains heading to Germany. Elena's mind raced through the possibilities for response. Warning everyone on the lists was impossible. There were too many people scattered across too wide an area, and most of them had no way to flee quickly enough to avoid capture. A direct military response was equally impossible. The resistance network, while effective at small operations, couldn't possibly stand against 700 well-armed troops in open combat. But there was another option, one that Elena had been unconsciously preparing for since her failure to kill Mueller.
If she couldn't save all the potential victims, she might be able to save most of them by striking at the heart of the German operation.
Where is the command center for the operation?
Elena asked.
Anna pointed to a location on the map that Elena recognized immediately. The Villa Marchetti, about 20 kilometers north of here. It used to belong to a textile manufacturer before the war. The Germans have been using it as a regional headquarters for the past 6 months. Elena knew the villa well. It had belonged to distant relatives of her family, and she had attended gatherings there as a child. The building sat on a hilltop overlooking the surrounding valley, with commanding views of all the roads leading to and from the major towns in the region. Its isolated location made it perfect for coordinating a large-scale operation without interference.
How many German officers are there?
Helena continued.
47 according to our intelligence, Anna replied.
The operational command staff, communications specialists, and coordination officers for all the individual raid teams. If something happened to them, Elena nodded slowly. If the command structure for Operation Alpine Cleansing could be eliminated, the individual raid teams would be operating blind. Without central coordination, timing, and communication, the operation would collapse into chaos, giving thousands of people the chance to escape or hide. What kind of defenses does the villa have? Anna spread out a detailed sketch that showed guard positions, defensive emplacements, and the internal layout of the building. 24 guards stationed around the perimeter, with another dozen inside the building. Machine gun positions covering all the approaches, and radio communication with German units throughout the region. Elena studied the defensive arrangements, her medical training helping her visualize the villa's vulnerabilities in the same way she might diagnose a patient's condition. The Germans had positioned their defenses to repel a conventional military attack, but they weren't expecting a medical intervention. Anna, I need you to gather every member of our network who's willing to participate in a desperate operation.
Tell them we have 6 hours to save 3,000 lives, but that most of us probably won't survive the attempt. Over the next 4 hours, Elena coordinated the most audacious operation in the history of the northern Italian resistance.
Using her detailed knowledge of the villa's layout and her understanding of German military procedures, she developed a plan that combined medical expertise with guerrilla tactics in ways that no one had ever attempted. The key insight came from Elena's nursing experience with infectious diseases. The villa's water supply came from a well located within the defensive perimeter, making it impossible to approach directly. But Elena knew that the building also had an extensive wine cellar with large storage tanks that fed into the villa's internal plumbing system. Working with Signora Benedetti, who had connections to the region's wine merchants, Elena arranged for a special delivery to the villa. The wine barrels contained more than just alcohol. They also carried a carefully calculated mixture of sedatives and hallucinogens that Elena had prepared using chemicals stolen from the hospital pharmacy. The plan required precise timing and enormous risk. Elena herself would have to infiltrate the villa during the delivery to ensure that the contaminated wine reached the German officers' evening meal. Anna and 12 other resistance fighters would position themselves around the villa's perimeter, ready to attack once the chemical agents took effect. At 4 in the afternoon, Elena disguised herself as a wine merchant's assistant and approached the villa in a delivery truck driven by one of Signora Benedetti's contacts. The German guards, accustomed to regular supply deliveries, barely glanced at her papers before waving the truck through the outer checkpoint. Inside the villa, Elena moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, using her childhood memories of the building's layout to navigate directly to the wine storage areas. The German officers were busy with their operational planning, paying no attention to what they assumed was routine supply management. Elena had 40 minutes to complete her sabotage before the evening meal began. Working quickly but carefully, she introduced her chemical mixture into the wine that would be served with dinner, calculating dosages based on the number of officers and their estimated body weights. The sedatives would take effect gradually, making the German officers increasingly drowsy and confused without immediately alerting them to the fact that they had been poisoned. The hallucinogens would follow, creating disorientation and panic that would make coordinated resistance impossible. As Elena completed her sabotage, she had an unexpected encounter that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Moving through the villa's corridors toward her escape route, she passed an open door and heard a voice speaking in accented Italian. Elena? Elena Marchetti? She turned to see a German officer standing in the doorway. Not just any officer, but Oberst Heinrich Müller, the man she had failed to kill 6 weeks earlier. He looked healthier than when she had last seen him through her rifle scope, apparently having recovered completely from the bacterial infection she had caused. I thought I recognized you, Müller said, stepping into the corridor. You're one of the nurses from the Bergamo hospital. What are you doing here?
Elena's mind raced through possible responses.
Muller clearly didn't suspect her true identity, but his presence complicated her escape plan dramatically. If she tried to leave immediately, he might become suspicious. If she stayed to maintain her cover, she might be trapped in the villa when the chemical agents took effect. Wine delivery, Elena said, simply holding up an empty bottle. The kitchen staff needed help with the inventory. Muller nodded casually, but Elena could see him studying her face more carefully. You look familiar for another reason, too. Have we met before? Perhaps at the hospital when I was treated for that unfortunate illness in December. Elena felt ice forming in her stomach. If Muller connected her to his mysterious illness, he would immediately realize that she was part of the resistance network. The entire operation would be compromised, and thousands of people would die in the raids that would begin in 7 hours. I don't recall treating you specifically, Elena replied, trying to keep her voice steady. But I treat many patients. Perhaps you remember me from the general ward. Müller continued to study her face, and Elena could see recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. In desperation, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Elena stepped closer to Muller, as if she were going to say something confidential. Instead, she reached into her medical bag and withdrew a scalpel, driving the thin blade upward between his ribs and into his heart with the precision of someone who understood anatomy perfectly.
Mueller's eyes widened in shock, but he died too quickly to make any sound.
Elena caught his body as it fell, dragging him into the nearby room and closing the door. She had just committed her first direct murder, and the clinical efficiency with which she had done it surprised her more than the moral weight of the action. There was no time for reflection. Elena had to escape the villa before Mueller's absence was noticed, and she had to ensure that the evening meal proceeded as planned so that her chemical sabotage would take effect. 20 minutes later, Elena was outside the villa's defensive perimeter, watching through binoculars as Anna and the other resistance fighters prepared for the attack. The plan called for them to wait until 9 o'clock, giving the chemical agents time to affect the German officers before launching their assault. At 8:30, Elena saw lights beginning to flicker irregularly in the villa's windows, the first sign that the sedatives were taking effect. By 9 o'clock, the regular movement of guards around the building had become noticeably sluggish and disorganized.
Anna's attack began with a series of explosions that destroyed the villa's radio equipment, cutting off communication with the German units preparing for the morning raids.
Elena watched as her fellow resistance fighters moved through the defensive positions, meeting little organized resistance from guards who were struggling with confusion and disorientation.
But the operation took a devastating turn when German reinforcements arrived unexpectedly from a nearby garrison. Elena watched in horror as Anna and 6 other resistance fighters were pinned down by machine gun fire in the villa's main courtyard, with no way to retreat or advance. Without conscious thought, Elena picked up the rifle she had brought as backup and began moving toward the battle. Her medical training had taught her to run toward dangerous situations, not away from them, when lives were at stake.
Elena's approach to the villa took her through a wooded area that provided cover from the German defensive positions. From an elevated position about 200 meters from the main building, she had clear lines of sight to the machine gun nests that were threatening her fellow resistance fighters. The woman who had hesitated to kill Mueller 6 weeks earlier no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that preserving some lives required ending others, that healing sometimes required violence, that mercy could be the cruelest choice of all. Elena's first shot eliminated the German machine gunner who was preventing Anna's escape. Her second shot killed the officer who was trying to coordinate the defense. Her third shot destroyed a spotlight that was illuminating the courtyard where the resistance fighters were trapped. Over the next 20 minutes, Elena systematically eliminated 12 German soldiers, using the marksmanship skills Anna had taught her and the anatomical knowledge that made every shot lethal. She felt no emotion during the killing, only the same focused concentration she had always brought to complex medical procedures. When the shooting stopped, 41 German officers were dead from chemical poisoning, and 28 soldiers had been killed in the battle. Elena and 7 surviving resistance fighters had destroyed the operational command for the largest anti-resistance operation in northern Italian history. Operation Alpine Cleansing collapsed completely without its coordination center. Individual German units, lacking orders and communication, either returned to their bases or conducted random, ineffective raids that missed their intended targets. Of the 3,000 people on the German arrest lists, fewer than 200 were actually captured, and most of them were rescued by follow-up resistance operations within days. Elena had saved thousands of lives in a single night, but the cost had been enormous. 6 resistance fighters had died in the attack on the villa, including Father Martinez, who had been killed while destroying the radio equipment.
Elena herself had killed 13 people directly and 41 more through chemical poisoning.
In the weeks that followed, the story of the nurse who had wielded a rifle to flip the battle spread throughout occupied Europe. Resistance networks in other countries sent representatives to learn from Elena's tactics. German military analysts studied the villa attack to understand how a small group of civilians had defeated a superior military force. But for Elena, the victory felt hollow. She had saved thousands of lives by taking dozens of others, proving her effectiveness as a killer while forever compromising her identity as a healer. She continued her resistance work for the remainder of the war, but she never again experienced the moral certainty that had once defined her calling. When the war ended in 1945, Elena returned to conventional nursing, but she was forever changed by what she had learned about the relationship between healing and killing, between preserving life and taking it. She had discovered that in the darkest moments of human history, even healers must sometimes become warriors, and that the most profound act of mercy can be the deliberate ending of a life. Elena Marchetti died in 1987, having spent the last 40 years of her life working in children's hospitals throughout post-war Europe. She never spoke publicly about her wartime activities, and most of her colleagues knew her only as an exceptionally dedicated pediatric nurse. But those who had survived because of her actions remembered her differently, as the woman who had proven that sometimes the gentlest hands can wield the deadliest weapons, and that the greatest healers are those willing to sacrifice their own innocence to preserve the lives of others. The villa where Elena made her stand was eventually converted into a memorial for resistance fighters throughout Europe. A plaque near the entrance bears a simple inscription: in memory of those who chose to act when action was needed most.
It doesn't mention Elena by name, but everyone who visits understands that it refers to the nurse who learned to kill in order to continue healing, and who changed the course of history with a handful of resistance fighters and the courage to do what needed to be done.